The massive space station hung in the void like a glittering jewel, its crystal walls reflecting the light of distant stars. Inside the Grand Council chamber, hundreds of alien beings sat in circular rows that stretched up toward the domed ceiling. The air hummed with the sound of different breathing patterns, clicking sounds, and the soft whoosh of gas-based creatures floating in their containment fields. Ambassador Marcus Thompson walked slowly down the center aisle, his black dress shoes clicking against the polished metal floor. The sound echoed in the vast chamber, and he could feel thousands of alien eyes watching his every step. Next to him, Dr. Emma Clark carried herself with quiet confidence, her brown hair pulled back in a neat bun and her blue eyes taking in every detail of the amazing scene around them. The humans were tiny compared to most of the other beings in the room. Above them, the Zephyrians dominated the highest tier of seating like kings looking down at peasants. Their emerald green scales caught the light as they moved, and their long necks swayed with an air of supreme confidence. These lizard-like creatures had ruled galactic politics for 3,000 years, and they wanted everyone to know it. Marcus stopped at the center of the chamber where a small platform waited for them. The translator device attached to his collar crackled to life as Speaker Veltar began to speak. The Zephyrian leader was enormous, nearly 12 feet tall when he stood to his full height. His vertical pupils fixed on the two humans like a snake studying mice. "So these are the humans," Veltar said, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. The translator made his voice sound cold and mocking. "These mammals who have barely learned to crawl between the stars think they deserve a place among us." Laughter filled the chamber, but it was not the warm laughter of friends sharing a joke. This was the cruel laughter of bullies enjoying someone else's pain. The crystalline beings in the middle rows chimed like broken glass, while the gas creatures pulsed with colors that the translation system rendered as amusement. Even the insect-like hive minds clicked their mandibles in what their translators called joy at inferior beings. Emma felt her cheeks burn with anger, but she kept her face calm. She had studied these creatures for months, learning their customs and their weaknesses. She knew this was all a show designed to make humans feel small and unworthy. "The Galactic Council has existed for over 3 millennia, Veltar continued, enjoying himself immensely. "We have brought peace to 1,000 worlds, established trade routes across the galaxy, and created the greatest civilization the universe has ever seen. And now, these primitive creatures who discovered fire only yesterday in cosmic terms want to sit at our table." More laughter echoed through the chamber. Marcus clenched his fists but forced himself to remain still. This was exactly what they had expected, but it still hurt to hear. "However," Veltar said, raising one clawed hand for silence, "we are not unreasonable beings. We believe in giving every species a fair chance to prove their worth." His smile showed rows of sharp teeth. "We have a test for you, little mammals." The chamber fell silent. Even the constant background hum of life support systems seemed to quiet as everyone waited to hear what impossible task the Zephyrians would demand. "For 3,000 years, Veltar announced, the greatest minds of our galaxy have worked on one problem. We have computer systems that can calculate the movement of entire star systems. We have scientists who can bend space and time to their will. We have philosophers who understand the deepest mysteries of existence. But none of us, despite all our advancement and wisdom, have been able to create a truly universal translation system." He gestured toward the walls of the chamber, where hundreds of different translation devices blinked and hummed as they struggled to convert the speech of one species into something another could understand. "Our current systems work poorly," Veltar continued. "They miss cultural meanings, emotional context, and the deeper significance behind words. Many of our greatest diplomatic failures have happened because we simply could not understand each other properly. Trade deals have collapsed because of translation errors. Wars have started over misunderstood communications." Emma began to see where this was heading, and her heart sank. They were being set up for the most spectacular failure possible. "If these humans are truly worthy of joining our council," Veltar said, his voice dripping with false kindness, "then surely they can solve this simple problem that has defeated our best minds for 3 millennia. He paused for effect. "Create a universal translation system that works perfectly for all 847 known intelligent species. You have 6 months. The chamber erupted in what could only be described as savage joy. The aliens were not just laughing now, they were celebrating what they saw as humanity's certain doom. Some species had betting pools running on how badly the humans would fail. Others were already planning the entertainment they would enjoy watching the mammals struggle with an impossible task. But Emma stepped forward before Marcus could speak. Her clear voice cut through the noise like a knife through silk. "We accept your challenge, Speaker Veltar." The laughter died instantly. Even Veltar seemed shocked by her immediate acceptance. He had expected the humans to beg for an easier test or ask for more time. Furthermore, Emma continued, when we succeed, we want more than just membership. We want humanity to be given the position of chief communication facilitator for the entire council. Now the chamber was completely silent. The audacity of this tiny human female demanding not just membership but a position of authority left everyone speechless. Veltar recovered first, his laughter harsh and bitter. Very well, mammal. When you fail, humanity will be barred from council membership for the next 100 years. And you will broadcast your failure to every world in known space, so all can see the price of arrogance. Marcus and Emma exchanged one quick glance. They both knew they had just walked into a carefully prepared trap. But they also knew it was their only chance to prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars. Agreed, Marcus said firmly. As the two humans turned to leave the chamber, the sounds of alien celebration followed them. But neither human looked back, and both were already making plans that would soon turn the galaxy upside down. The old conference room at the Lunar Research Station had seen better days. The white walls were scuffed from years of use, and the metal table in the center bore coffee stains and scratch marks from countless meetings. But today, this humble room would become the birthplace of something that would change the galaxy forever. Dr. Emma Clark stood at the front of the room, looking at the strangest collection of people she had ever assembled. Most scientific projects use teams of experts from the same field, but Emma had thrown that rule book out the window. She knew that solving an impossible problem required impossible thinking. Thank you all for coming, Emma began, her voice steady despite the enormous weight on her shoulders. I know this seems crazy. 5 months and 20 days to solve a problem that has stumped the entire galaxy for 3,000 years. But I believe we can do it, precisely because we are not like them. Professor William Hayes sat in the corner, his thick glasses reflecting the overhead lights. The quantum mathematician from Oxford looked like he had not slept in days, which was probably true. His wild gray hair stuck up in all directions, and his notebook was already filled with complex equations that most people could not even pronounce. The Zephyrians think like Zephyrians, William muttered, tapping his pen against the table. All their brilliant minds are brilliant in the same way. They approach every problem with the same logic, the same assumptions. That is why they keep failing. Dr. Alice Mitchell nodded from across the table. The marine biologist had spent 15 years studying how whales and dolphins communicated, and her research had led to breakthroughs in understanding non-human intelligence. She was a small woman with sun-weathered skin and bright green eyes that missed nothing. I have been thinking about this since Emma called me, Alice said. The aliens are trying to translate languages, but language is just the surface. Underneath, you have completely different ways of thinking, different ways of experiencing reality. A dolphin does not just speak differently than a human, it thinks differently. David Porter leaned forward with interest. The musician had been studying something he called emotional resonance mapping, trying to understand how music could convey feelings across cultural boundaries. His long fingers moved constantly, as if he was playing an invisible piano while he talked. Music works because it bypasses language entirely, David explained. A sad song makes people feel sad even if they do not understand the words. There are mathematical patterns in sound that connect directly to emotion. Maybe we need to find the mathematical patterns that connect directly to thought. Thomas Wright, the computer programmer, looked skeptical. He was used to dealing with problems that had clear solutions, not impossible puzzles about alien minds. His laptop was already open, and lines of code scrolled across the screen as he worked on 3 different projects at once. I still do not understand how we are supposed to program something when we do not even know how these alien minds work, Thomas said. I mean, we have some data from the few species that visit Earth, but 847 different ways of thinking? How do we even begin? Rebecca Foster, the anthropologist, smiled at his confusion. She had spent years studying how different human cultures communicated, and she knew that the challenge was not as impossible as it seemed. Her curly red hair bounced as she shook her head. You are thinking about this wrong, Thomas, Rebecca said. We do not need to understand every single species perfectly. We need to understand the universal principles that underlie all communication. Every culture I have studied has the same basic needs: to share information, to express emotions, to build relationships. The forms are different, but the functions are the same. James Harrison had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he looked up from the complex patterns he had been drawing on his notepad. The mathematician had autism, and his brain processed information in ways that often led to insights that others missed. His drawings looked like chaos to everyone else, but Emma could see there was a hidden order in them. They are all connected, James said softly. All these different ways of thinking, they are like different instruments in an orchestra. Each one plays a different part, but they are all playing the same underlying music. We just need to find the sheet music. Dr. Helen Baker, the child psychologist, nodded enthusiastically. She had been studying how young children learn to communicate, and she had discovered that there were certain patterns that appeared in every human child, regardless of culture or language. James is right, Helen said. There are universal patterns in how minds develop and learn. If we can identify those patterns, we might be able to create a system that adapts to any type of thinking, no matter how alien it seems to us. Emma looked around the room at her unlikely team. A mathematician who saw equations in everything, a marine biologist who spoke whale, a musician who heard emotions in sound waves, a programmer who thought in code, an anthropologist who understood cultural differences, an autistic genius who saw hidden patterns, and a psychologist who knew how minds learn to communicate. By every traditional measure, this team should have failed before it started. They came from completely different fields, they approached problems in completely different ways, and they barely spoke the same scientific language among themselves. But Emma saw something else. She saw minds that thought outside normal boundaries, people who were used to solving problems that others said could not be solved. Most importantly, she saw people who understood that communication was not about proving superiority, but about building connections. Here is what we are going to do, Emma announced. We are not going to build a translator. Translators convert words from one language to another, and that approach has already failed. We are going to build something completely new. We are going to build a bridge between minds. The team looked at her with a mixture of excitement and terror. They all knew they were attempting something that had never been done before, something that might be impossible. But they also knew that if anyone could do the impossible, it would be a group crazy enough to try. 3 months into their impossible task, the team had filled every wall of their laboratory with equations, diagrams, and charts that looked like the work of brilliant madmen. Coffee cups and food containers littered every surface, and nobody could remember the last time anyone had gone home to sleep in their own bed. James Harrison stood in front of the largest wall display, his finger tracing patterns that seemed to shift and dance before his eyes. For weeks, he had been staring at the same collection of data, communication samples from 12 different alien species that had visited Earth over the past decade. To everyone else, the patterns looked like random chaos. But James saw something different. Emma, he called out, his voice carrying that special excitement that came with discovery. You need to see this right now. Emma looked up from her own workstation, where she had been trying to decode the mathematical structure of ethereal electromagnetic communications. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, and her hair had escaped from its usual neat style, but she immediately recognized the tone in James's voice. The entire team gathered around the wall display as James began to explain what he had found. The patterns showed waveforms from different species, the clicking sounds of the insectoid hive minds, the color pulses of the gas-based nebulans, the electromagnetic sculptures of the ethereals, and even the chemical cascades that the plant-like Verdians used to share complex thoughts. Look at this, James said, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface to highlight certain sections. At first glance, these all seem completely different. Different frequencies, different mediums, different speeds. But if you look deeper, if you look at the underlying structure. He manipulated the display to show the mathematical foundations beneath each communication method. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge that made Alice gasp with recognition. They are harmonics, she breathed. Like whale songs. Different whales sing at different pitches and speeds, but the emotional content follows the same mathematical patterns. David Porter, the musician, started nodding rapidly as understanding flooded his face. It is like different instruments playing the same piece of music, he said excitedly. A piano and a violin sound completely different, but they can play the same melody because the mathematical relationships between the notes are identical. William Hayes pushed his glasses up his nose and studied the equations more carefully. As a quantum mathematician, he could see implications that the others were still grasping for. James, this is incredible, William said slowly. You are showing us that all consciousness, regardless of the species, operates on the same fundamental wave principles. The frequency is different, the medium is different, but the wave structure itself is universal, Emma finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The implications were staggering. Every thinking being in the universe processes information as waves. Emotional waves, logical waves, memory waves. We have been trying to translate the content, but we should have been translating the wave patterns themselves. Thomas Wright immediately began typing furiously on his laptop, his programmer's mind already seeing how this discovery could be turned into working code. If we can map the wave signatures of different types of thoughts, we could create a system that reads the quantum signature of any communication attempt and translates not just the words, but the actual meaning behind them. Rebecca Foster was thinking about the anthropological implications. This means that every species, no matter how alien, has the same basic emotional and logical structures. They express them differently, but the underlying patterns are the same. Fear is fear, joy is joy, logical reasoning follows the same mathematical principles. Helen Baker, the child psychologist, suddenly understood something that made her laugh with delight. This is how children learn to communicate before they even know language, she said. They respond to emotional patterns, to the music in their parents' voices. We are born knowing how to read these wave patterns. We just forget how to do it as we learn to focus on words instead. Over the following weeks, the team worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They had named their discovery Quantum Empathic Translation, or QET for short. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of translating words from one language to another, their system would read the quantum signatures of thought patterns and translate the underlying meaning, emotional context, and cultural implications directly from mind to mind. The breakthrough came when they managed to establish communication with Zephyra, an ethereal being who had been living on Earth as part of a cultural exchange program. Ethereals did not use words at all. Instead, they created complex three-dimensional sculptures out of electromagnetic fields, each one representing entire concepts and emotional states that could take human languages hundreds of words to express. Emma put on the prototype QET headset and activated the system. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, her mind was flooded with something that was not quite sight, not quite sound, not quite feeling, but somehow all three at once. The ethereal's greeting hit her consciousness like a warm wave of sunrise, carrying with it layers of meaning that no translation could have conveyed. Welcome, curiosity about human nature, hope for understanding, gratitude for acceptance, and a deep sense of beauty at the possibility of true communication between different forms of life. Tears streamed down Emma's face as she experienced not just what the ethereal was saying, but what it was feeling. For the first time in history, two completely different forms of consciousness had truly understood each other. It worked, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. It actually worked. I did not just understand what Zephyra was saying. I felt it, I experienced it exactly as she meant it to be experienced. Thomas, monitoring the quantum field generators, noticed something unexpected in his readings. Emma, the system is learning, he said with excitement. Each successful translation is creating permanent pathways. The more it translates, the better it gets. It is not just a translator anymore. It is becoming a living bridge between minds. They had done it. With 2 months still remaining, they had accomplished the impossible. But Emma knew that their real challenge was still ahead. They had to demonstrate their miracle to a galaxy that expected them to fail, and failure would mean the end of humanity's dreams among the stars. The Galactic Council chamber had never seen a crowd like this before. Every seat was filled, and hundreds more beings floated, crawled, or hovered in the spaces between the official seating areas. Word had spread across the galaxy that the humans were actually going to attempt their impossible demonstration, and nobody wanted to miss what promised to be the most spectacular failure in galactic history. The betting pools had grown beyond anything seen before. Wealthy Zephyrians had wagered entire star systems on the humans' failure. The crystalline shimmering collective had bet their most precious sun crystals. Even species that usually avoided gambling had placed small wagers, just to be part of the historic moment when the arrogant mammals learned their place in the universe. Speaker Veltar sat in his golden throne-like chair, his emerald scales practically glowing with satisfaction. He had spent the morning practicing his dismissal speech, the one that would formally banish humanity from consideration for council membership for the next century. He had even added a few extra insults about primitive mammalian intelligence that he thought were particularly clever. Marcus Thompson and Emma Clark walked slowly down the center aisle, and the chamber erupted in what could only be called cruel amusement. The two humans looked so small compared to the massive alien beings surrounding them, and they carried only a simple black briefcase between them. After 6 months of work, this tiny case was all they had to show for their efforts. "Look at that," hissed one Zephyrian to another, loud enough for his translator to broadcast to the entire chamber. 6 months of work, and they bring a suitcase. These mammals truly have no understanding of the complexity they attempted to solve. More laughter filled the air as the humans reached the center platform. Some of the gas-based nebulons pulsed with colors that their translators rendered as extreme amusement at inferior beings, while the insectoid hive minds clicked their mandibles in harmonized mockery. Emma set the briefcase down on the demonstration table and looked up at the thousands of alien faces watching her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their certainty that she was about to humiliate herself and her entire species. But instead of fear, she felt a calm confidence that surprised even herself. Honored delegates of the Galactic Council, Emma began, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. For 3,000 years, the greatest minds of your civilizations have sought to create a universal translation system. Today, we present to you not just a translator, but something far more important. We offer you a bridge between minds themselves. She opened the briefcase, revealing a crystalline device no larger than a human hand. It looked almost disappointingly simple, just a clear crystal with gentle lights pulsing inside it like a captured star. Many of the aliens leaned forward, trying to understand how something so small could possibly solve such an enormous problem. We call it the quantum empathic translator, Emma continued. It does not convert words from one language to another. Instead, it connects consciousness itself, allowing beings to experience thoughts and feelings exactly as they were intended to be experienced. Veltar's vertical pupils narrowed as he studied the small device. Something about the human female's confidence worried him, though he could not quite identify what. Bold words, mammal, he hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. But words are easy to speak. Can your tiny device actually function, or is this merely another example of human arrogance? Emma smiled, her expression that somehow managed to be both gentle and confident. Let us show you. She activated the QET device with a simple touch. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The crystal's internal lights pulsed a bit brighter, but there was no dramatic display of power, no spectacular show of technology. Then, slowly, something extraordinary began to occur throughout the chamber. A Nebulan delegate, trying to ask a question about trade regulations, found that his hour-long chemical communication was instantly understood by everyone present. Not just the words, but the underlying concern for his people's welfare, the careful diplomatic politeness, the hope for fair treatment. Species that had never been able to communicate with gas-based beings suddenly understood exactly what he was feeling. An ethereal in the upper galleries created one of her electromagnetic sculptures, a complex three-dimensional poem about the beauty of different minds coming together. For the first time in galactic history, every being in the chamber could experience the sculpture exactly as the ethereal intended, not as strange patterns of energy, but as pure emotion and meaning flowing directly into their consciousness. The chamber began to buzz with activity as delegates realized what was happening. A centuries-old trade dispute between the silicon-based crystallines and the methane-breathing Vortians suddenly made sense to both sides as they finally understood each other's environmental needs and limitations. Negotiations that had been stalled for decades began moving forward as species realized their disagreements were based on translation errors rather than actual conflicts of interest. But the most shocking revelations came as the QET system spread its influence throughout the chamber. Ancient diplomatic communications were suddenly understood in their true context, and many species began to realize they had been manipulated for centuries. The Vortians, who had been paying tribute to the Zephyrians for 300 years based on a treaty of protection, suddenly understood that the original agreement had been deliberately mistranslated. They had been paying for protection from threats that did not exist, while the real meaning of their ancestral agreement had been about mutual trade benefits. The crystallines discovered that their exclusion from certain shipping routes had nothing to do with incompatible communication methods, and everything to do with the Zephyrians wanting to control those profitable trade lanes themselves. Species after species began to understand how they had been deceived, manipulated, and cheated through deliberate translation errors and communication barriers. The chamber erupted in chaos, but it was not the chaos of confusion. It was the chaos of understanding, of revelations, of connections being made for the first time in millennia. Ancient enemies began tentative conversations as they realized their conflicts were based on misunderstandings. Isolated species found themselves welcomed into discussions they had never been able to participate in before. And through it all, Speaker Veltar sat frozen in his golden chair, watching 3,000 years of Zephyrian dominance crumble around him as the galaxy discovered the truth about his people's diplomatic successes. The silence that followed was perhaps the most profound in the Council's 3,000-year history. Every being in the chamber sat perfectly still, processing not just the successful demonstration they had witnessed, but the devastating revelations that came with it. The QET system continued to pulse quietly on the demonstration table, its gentle light now seeming to illuminate truths that had been hidden in darkness for millennia. Speaker Veltar remained frozen in his golden chair, his emerald scales no longer gleaming with confidence but dulled with something that looked very much like fear. Through the quantum empathic connection, every being in the chamber could feel his emotions as clearly as their own, and what they felt was shame, panic, and desperate anger at being exposed. The Vortian delegate who had discovered the truth about his people's tribute payments stood slowly, his methane-breathing apparatus hissing softly. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of 3 centuries of deception. For 300 years, he said, his translator now perfectly conveying not just his words but his deep sense of betrayal, my people have paid tribute to the Zephyrians because we believed we had agreed to protection from the Void Pirates. Now I understand the truth. Our ancestors agreed to a mutual trade partnership. There were never any pirates threatening us. The Zephyrians created that threat to steal our resources. A murmur of understanding rippled through the chamber as other species began to examine their own diplomatic histories with new clarity. The crystallines discovered that mining rights they had given up were based on false claims about dangerous radiation that had never existed. The plant-like Verdians realized that their agricultural treaties had been deliberately mistranslated to give the Zephyrians control over their most fertile worlds. Emma watched from the center platform as the political structure of the galaxy shifted before her eyes. The QET technology was spreading beyond the chamber through quantum entanglement, creating a communication network that was already reaching distant star systems. Within hours, every corner of civilized space would have access to true understanding for the first time in history. Dr. William Hayes, monitoring the situation from their lunar laboratory, could hardly believe the data flowing across his screens. Requests for the QET technology were pouring in from worlds that had been isolated for centuries due to communication difficulties. Species that had been considered too primitive or incompatible for galactic civilization were suddenly finding their voices heard and understood. The singing stones of Kepler 442c, who communicated through vibrations in solid rock and had been ignored for millennia, were now participating in trade negotiations. The plasma dancers from the corona of Proxima Centauri, whose thoughts moved at the speed of light and had been considered impossible to communicate with, were sharing scientific discoveries that revolutionized physics. But the most profound changes were happening right there in the council chamber. Marcus Thompson watched as ancient enemies began tentative conversations, their conflicts dissolving as they realized they had been fighting over misunderstandings rather than real differences. Economic partnerships that had been impossible due to communication barriers were forming spontaneously as species discovered they had complementary needs and resources. The betting pools that had been running against humanity's success suddenly found themselves in chaos as it became clear that the humans had not just succeeded, they had fundamentally changed the nature of galactic civilization itself. Speaker Veltar finally found his voice, though it took visible effort for him to speak. The words seemed to stick in his throat like poison he was forced to swallow. The humans have completed their task, he managed, each word carrying undertones of humiliation that the entire chamber could feel through the QET connection. By the laws of the council, they have earned their membership. But Marcus stepped forward before the formal ceremony could begin, and his next word sent another shock through the already stunned assembly. We accept our seat on the council, he said clearly, but we also propose that our first official act should be the establishment of universal communication accords. Every species in the galaxy should have free access to this technology, regardless of their current political status or council membership. The chamber erupted in sounds that the QET system translated as joy, hope, and gratitude from hundreds of different species. For the first time in galactic history, isolated worlds would be able to join the greater community. Species that had been marginalized or ignored would find their voices heard and their contributions valued. But from the Zephyrian section came feelings of barely controlled rage and desperation. Their entire power structure was crumbling, and they could do nothing to stop it. Emma looked up at the Zephyrian delegation and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but sympathy. Through the QET connection, she could sense their genuine confusion and fear. They had ruled for so long through manipulation and control that they had forgotten how to exist in a world of equals. Speaker Veltar, she said gently, this does not have to be the end for your people. True communication means everyone benefits, including the Zephyrians. You have knowledge, experience, and resources that the galaxy needs. But now you will have to offer them as partners, not as rulers. The formal ceremony that followed was unlike anything in council history. Instead of the usual cold political rituals, it became a celebration of understanding and connection. As Veltar was forced to formally welcome humanity to the council, his words carried undertones of defeat that everyone could feel, but also the first faint stirrings of something that might eventually become acceptance. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The Zephyrians had designed this challenge to humiliate humanity and prove their unworthiness. Instead, the humans had created something that would unite the galaxy in ways the Council had never achieved in 3 millennia of existence. As the ceremony concluded and delegates began planning for a future of true understanding, Emma couldn't help but smile at the memory of Neil Armstrong's famous words. One small seat for humanity had indeed become one giant leap for galactic civilization, not through conquest or domination, but through the most human of all qualities, the desire to understand and be understood. The age of manipulation and control was over. The age of true communication had begun.